Thank you all for joining us this evening. To begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of not only the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, but to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which our national and international audience are standing on tonight, and to recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm Phil Chum, and this is Samuel Williams from the New South Wales EmAGN Committee. This talk is part of the Australian Institute of Architects Lean In series, organised by EmAGN New South Wales and SONA. EmAGN is a national network to support and advocate for graduate and emerging architects around the country.
Tonight we will be joined by Yuri Lev and Andrew Daly, who will both be giving presentations. This will then be followed by a Q&A session. So a few housekeeping rules to be started. The chat's open for questions and comments throughout the presentation, so be sure to get involved and post questions and comments, and we'll try to cover all of them at the discussion at the end of the talk. And just, obviously you've joined on mute and your video's off, but just make sure that that doesn't change. Cool. So in Australia, we've moved from one crisis to another, and for some, the bushfires might seem like a distant memory, especially during the current pandemic. The purpose of tonight's talk is to shed light on the summer of bushfires and to touch base on the initiatives of architects in Australia and assist and support communities who have been affected. The 2019-2020 Australian bushfire season began with several serious uncontrolled fires in June 2019. Throughout the summer, hundreds of fires burnt, mainly in the southeast of the country, peaking during December to January. As of March, the fires burnt an estimated 18.6 million hectares and destroyed over 5,900 buildings, including close to 3,000 homes. In response to the bushfires, Architects Assist was formed and currently represents a collective effort of over 600 architecture firms across Australia, dedicating their resources to pro bono work, as well as 1,400 students and graduates of architecture. Architecture Assist acts as a simple referral service between clients and registered architects, but does not itself provide architectural services. In late February 2020, Architects Assist began to integrate professionals from related fields in the built environment industry, such as landscape architects and planners.
Yuri Lev is the founder of Architects Assist and the director of his own practice. In his work, Yuri strives to utilise the appropriate design language of the region in which it is placed, or if absent, seeks to define it. His buildings rely heavily on natural and local materials and construction methods. Tonight, Yuri will be talking about all things AA and what architects and designers can do for affected communities. Andrew Daly is a registered architect and is the founding director of SUPERCONTEXT, an architecture and design studio based in Sydney. SUPERCONTEXT works across all types of architecture with a particular focus on cultural, educational and commercial projects, preferring complexity and challenge over the straightforward or reductive. Tonight, Andrew will be talking about his Kangaroo Valley project, which was referred to SUPERCONTEXT through the Architects Assist initiative. So first we'll have Yuri talk. So I'm gonna share the screen, Yuri, and if you could share your screen and you can take that away. And unmute as well, Yuri.
Indeed. Okay, thank you and hello. One sec, I'll need to get this under control. Share screen, here we are. Right, so yeah, thank you, and I'll take this as an opportunity to kind of update everyone on where we are at and maybe some of the work we've done to date and what we're looking at, what challenges we're looking at, what challenges we're facing in moving ahead. Tiny bit of a background about myself. So I'm from Czech Republic, from this beautiful city of Prague. I studied architecture in Newcastle under Rikla Plastrier, De Clares, Starch, and many other wonderful teachers who have regrettably been recently replaced. Yeah, I have some previous experience with disaster response and working with communities, and just to name a few would be the ArchiCamp, which was kind of a grassroots gathering of students helping in rural communities, typically rural communities, post-disaster kind of recovery and so on, and community projects like the Holterman Museum or the Hamilton Community Hall, which were basically community-driven projects that started as like a pro bono work, then securing funding, and then sort of evolving from there. And yeah, so bushfires in Australia, as Samuel summed up, we're not new to this. There's a bit of a graph that I stole from BBC, but I think you might have seen it before. Clearly, the damage is recurring, ongoing. Lots of people are dying every decade. You can see it's kind of unfortunate repeating pattern in this country. And it is certainly related to some extent to the climate change, but also to the population density and the way we sort of continue to occupy and subdue the landscape. I'll try to see if, sorry, I don't know how to switch off this window with all the faces, but it's okay, we'll go with that. The latest bushfires took, the reports vary largely, but according to the ABC, 12 million hectares, some people say more, 434 million tons of CO2 emitted, which is about the same as the Australian industry does in 1 year. And yeah, like probably every second Australian was directly affected by the smoke and associated health and other issues. Interesting graph here is the proportion of the land that was actually burnt or that was affected by the fires. And you can see that majority of it is essentially conservation land, interestingly, and also agricultural forest plantation, unsurprisingly, and then some residential and rural. These are some stats of what was actually damaged in terms of properties, or destroyed. So you have obviously vast number of outbuildings, which could be anything. But the more important part is the middle section, which shows the damage to buildings, to homes, and the destruction of homes. And again, the reports vary, and it's very hard even for me to get my hands on the correct numbers, but I think it will be well above 2,500 homes destroyed. And another interesting graph to consider is that approximately one quarter of Australian homes are uninsured. And I dare say that the percentage will be greater in those regions where these fires occurred and the greatest losses were inflicted. So we are dealing with vastly uninsured clients, and hence the formation of Architects Assist. This is kind of I'll try to switch this, sorry about it. I'll try to switch this. So I guess the notion of the Architects Assist is to create a platform for equity of access to architecture. I see it as healthcare or legal representation, as an essential, not a luxury. And it is inevitably and quite clearly a condition of our future survival. How will we build, how well, and what from, and where, and so on. So I consider architecture as a human right. This is the Architects Assist headquarters, as they were in January. We essentially, in the middle of the crisis, we were living on the road in a caravan and spent a few weeks running away from the fires, driving through, total darkness in the middle of the day, and sort of joining or kind of predicting where the fires would be, and trying to sort of avoid the worst of it. And by the 4th of January, I guess it occurs to me that maybe something might need to be done from the profession as a whole, as opposed to some sort of individual efforts, I guess, unorganized and somewhat chaotic. So I sort of tried to get some sort of organization going where, as architects or designers, we could sort of, as a whole, make ourselves available to the community and make ourselves easily approachable and accessible, as opposed to perhaps flooding the victims in all their misery with disorganized, chaotic offers of help from all ends, which is something that they unfortunately, despite all the goodwill, have to deal with, and oftentimes it leads to maybe underutilization of the offer at hand, offer of help at hand. Yeah, so 4th of January, we launched like a very simple website, which had a give assistance and get assistance forms. And we handled all the inquiries manually, which soon turned out to be slightly overwhelming. So eventually started sort of looking at ways of decentralizing and automating the process. Funnily enough, several days after we sort of published the AA website, clearly stating that it unites both architects and designers or graduates, someone took it upon themselves to report us to the Architect Registration Board. So I got a phone call, yeah, people weren't happy. So apparently we are misrepresenting what architects are, what not. So that luckily coincided with the interest from the Institute of Architects. And after a chat on the 9th of January, we decided to join forces and kind of legitimized the use of the word architect appropriately, so everyone was happy. And then by 15th of January, we had 540 firms registered and sheer number of students who were looking for ways to help. And we also started getting some first inquiries. Most people at that time were still fighting fires and kind of trying to comprehend what occurred. So we didn't expect any large numbers of inquiries initially, but we received 40 by the 15th of January. I handled all these manually. And I guess one of the first ones I received was passed on to Andrew. So he will talk about it later. I think it's actually the very first one that I received that went on to him. So the new website launched, and it essentially became an autonomous referral service. So we could sort of skip the middleman, I myself, and clients essentially were able to select and contact, address their chosen provider directly. And also the Institute of Landscape Architects and the Planning Institute have joined as well this effort, which is amazing and generous of them. The current workflow as it is consists of these few steps. So typically a client becomes aware of AA, and that's the tricky bit. So I'll get to that later again. But yeah, client becomes aware of the Architects Assist, and they visit our website. And it's fairly simple to go and locate a provider in the region, or I don't know why I'm seeing these red lines popping up on over my screen. But yeah, so yeah, they can easily contact a provider of their choosing, submit a simple assistance request form, which goes straight to the provider, who then contacts the client, assesses the situation, and based on that, they will make recommendation and importantly suggest a viable roadmap to recovery for that particular case. And then, I guess depending on the situation of the clients, they also can agree on the extent, if any, of free or discounted services appropriate to the situation. And providers are also encouraged to invite architecture students to assist with projects. The types of clients we have or have had are individuals of three main kinds, and that's basically people who perhaps have a good insurance payout, or they have sufficient funds. I think that's most of the clients who have reached us, and so they usually require some initial advice, some sort of like a roadmap, and then they're quite happy to either engage an architect commercially or they go some other way. Then you have the underinsured or clients with kind of limited funds, and then that typically results in some discounted services or partial pro bono scope. And then you have people who, and luckily or maybe unluckily, we haven't heard from that many of these, but who have no funds and no insurance. And there's been some tragic stories I've come across where, there's basically a step from homelessness. And so these clients will be relying vastly on donated materials and free help from community in rebuilding. And so in those instances, the architects or the providers render the full design service, typically pro bono. Then we have businesses in I guess there's like a minority target group, I'd say, but they do contact us sometimes. So they sort of look for advice how to sort of go forward. And then we had 2 or 3 communes or communities contact us, which are looking at larger scale projects. Like, say, one of them was looking at rebuilding, I think they said 50 buildings, residences, kind of like a rural land sharing group and things like that. But these tend to move very, very slowly. So I can see some potential there in the future, perhaps to involve like a larger groups of maybe students and coming to these sites and doing some actual hands-on work. But that's music of the future with the virus now and so on. It has been moving very slowly. Some graphs as to how we have performed. So this is the daily users, which I've been tracking, unfortunately, not from the very beginning, but 11, 12 of January. So we have these daily users of the website. So if you can see there was the initial like, wow, so I think that the initial couple of weeks, all that traffic on the website was generated vastly through the media. And even like, it's kind of consistent with what I see, like where they're coming from and so on. So that's kind of like a global traffic and people are just interested in looking at the website. But more interestingly, you can see like a stable kind of influx of users across the last, 5 months. These are some engagements that we've recorded. So this is again from the week 2 of the initiative. So there will be more than this, but there's been 10,000 unique users, 12,000 sessions. So some of them come back. Typically, they're served the first visit. And more importantly, pages per session. So the industry standard tends to be on a successful website, 2 pages per session on average, which means, people will basically go find a product and buy it, for instance, or they go find the news, read it. So that's like the average engagement. And then we have websites which keep people on for a bit longer, 10 with different pages or so. And then there's websites where basically don't work, and that's typically 1 or less on 1 page per session, 1.1 or something like that. So we're doing pretty well there. It's quite encouraging. And we have this average session duration, which is 2.5 minutes, which also suggests that people actually spend time reading the content and using the website. And then we have the bounce rate, which is 50%, which is also pretty amazing for a website of this kind. Again, that means that half people who come to the website actually are interested and engage with the content. And so there'll be either the providers or there'll be the clients. So here we have the provider engagement. So you can see a massive uptake at the beginning, clearly, with all the exposure that the initiative got. So that's when all the architects started coming in and signing up. And I think also just international and national users or people from the internet that read articles about it, just wanted to have a look what it's all about. But you can see there's also some ongoing engagement. But again, this is provider engagement. So there's like some 25, 19, 8 people per week. So, there's still the old architect maybe who hasn't heard about this or is checking back on what's up on the website, is there any updates and so on. And then we have the client engagement, which is the important bit really. And you can see again, a big uptake at the beginning, which I don't think were actual clients. Those would again be just random people from anywhere. But then you can see it's stabilizing around the sort of 103, 57, 68 weekly. That was February, and then it's sort of going down with the coronavirus. And encouragingly, this last week we've seen a doubling up of the numbers of actual clients sort of looking for providers and getting in touch with architects. So it seems to be working pretty well, at least for those who have internet, and that's one of the challenges. So the client engagement, not all of these were real actual clients, like I said, but I would say that we probably at least 100 served. And the bounce rate there is only 32%. So that means that whoever comes there looking for services actually very rarely leaves. So people actually tend to find what they are after. They fill out the form, they contact professionals. I've been asked about, by many of our members have been asked why aren't we getting any inquiries, and essentially there's 600 firms, and of course most of them will be from Sydney, Melbourne, and other big cities. And despite us encouraging clients to get in touch with firms more, further afield, because they may have better availability, of course, naturally they will still tend to first request help from someone more local. So, if you have 300 companies that you will, if you're one of them, that you will be contacted, and vice versa, if you are from Kangaroo Valley, like we have firms there in that area, or southern New South Wales, then you might be knee flooded. Should that happen, you're encouraged to temporarily remove your listing, and of course the clients will be naturally and automatically funneled to another nearby practice. But those are the practices that have been getting most of the inquiries. Then some successes, I guess, is that I see as successes of the whole initiative is, and then from feedback from clients, I guess, is the initial encouragement and emotional support. Like, unsurprisingly, I've had people, crying on the phone and explaining what happened, and feeling desperate, despite having perhaps had sufficient insurance payouts, still not believing that anything can be built or rebuilt with that money. So I guess just the initial shoulder to cry on, and somewhat educated opinion to share assisted a lot of these people in the first shock of what has happened to them, and that's oftentimes, and in most cases, all is actually required, surprisingly enough. So some sort of building environment counseling. And then you have another big thing we've been doing, and there's the client orientation and sort of roadmaps, like per case. So basically, clients have been getting in touch with the participating practices, and I guess all they really needed was some directions. Talk to these people. This is where you can get support. This is the first consultant you need to invite on site, or so oftentimes that's been sufficient. Then another thing that I see as a great success is the promotion and proliferation of sustainable and resilient design. So many of these projects, for a variety of reasons, which I'll address a bit later, have not gone ahead or stalled, but the initial conversation maybe got as far as development of some quite simple design or sketch, seldom even computerized, but explaining some of the correct and appropriate approaches to building in these fairly high risk areas and so on, or maybe discouragement from building there again in some instances. So that's kind of a good opportunity for architecture to sort of show its worth and clarify the place and agency of the profession in the broader community. So I think that's been really, really good. And then the difficulties, of course, are unreasonable intentions of some clients. Some people approach us and they have built before any legislation was in place as to where you can build in really high risk places, top of a cliff, somewhere, above bushy escarpment, which they don't own and can't manage, and so on. And so basically, if you rebuild there, you're guaranteed to burn again. And it's impossible to burn a house that's not flammable. Like, anything will burn, even a rock, given the rise temperatures. So these can be some reasonable intentions and expectations of the clients. And so I've had architects essentially saying, look, the client was unrealistic in what they expected, and I had to tell them that I can't possibly take responsibility, and encourage them or even suggest they would build on that site again. So that's actually not that uncommon. Delays in clearing of sites, that's surprising but ongoing issue. Months later, basically, it's typically the responsibility of the insurer, and if the clients are uninsured, it's even worse. But there's many sites that actually haven't been still cleared, and when you can't see the site, how can you design anything? So a lot of our projects are actually stalling at that stage, just waiting for the site to be visible. Then you have the tendency towards quick fix solutions, and that's just, I mean, it's understandable humanly, but it's crazy that time and time again I hear about cases where the client, has gone with maybe the concept design and so on to a certain stage, and then they've decided to just, just save money, put a house there, put a project home there and sell, or put a project home and be done with it. Partly, it's, I guess, humanly understandable on the grounds that people need to live somewhere, and of course, a project home, will have a sort of guaranteed time frame for delivery, and so they know, okay, we can be back living in our house, by summer, or maybe they hope by winter before the virus. So there's this kind of urgency that opens, unfortunately, door to a lot of really inferior designs, and without any doubt, these are absolutely unsuitable for those sites where they are being built. So project homes, it's like a big menace. And then we have the lack of awareness. That's a big one. We basically keep coming across communities that, and those are the worst affected oftentimes, that they don't really, they tend to be maybe older people, or people who don't have proper internet access or good internet access. Sometimes disadvantaged communities, typically, more remote and so on. And it's unrealistic to expect them to have heard about Architects Assist or anything really. That's sort of done online, any kind of initiative. So, and that's a really difficult one, because of course I, as a single person, or I can't travel. I mean, that was a plan before the virus, but I can't travel to all these places and talk to people. So that's something that's probably the biggest challenge we face. That the people who need us the most are the least likely to come across the offering. Out of the 3,000 houses that burned, or 2,500 houses that burns down, I would say probably half or 2/3 haven't heard about us, and probably at least half of them will be, people who wouldn't be that comfortable even going to the website and even navigating the, relatively simple to us directory and filling out the form. So I think it would be great if we could possibly, with the loosening of these restrictions, get architects or architecture students to actually visit these places and just talk to people, just make them aware that we are available for them if they need us. And then, of course, the difficulties with the, of course, the initial response was very passionate and broad, but it is the consistent long-term effort that counts. And this recovery, especially again with the virus, that's going to be 2 or 3 years minimum, probably a decade. So these are the difficulties, not few. And then we have the next steps that I envisage and hope for, and that's, of course, the outreach to isolated communities. Like I just said, I think that is the thing that can make the most difference in the short term, that we do actually visit and talk and make ourselves known, and the service available sort of known. And then, generally speaking, I think we need better environmental management. Who doesn't? I think we need better modes of occupation of the land, and we need better design and construction. So, if I may, I'll just quickly, to close, share a few ideas. This is a fun little Latin phrase, hic sunt leones, which used to be put on maps, old medieval maps, where the man didn't dare to tread, or hasn't treaded yet. And so unknown, forgotten areas. And that's how we tend to treat vast swaths of our landscape. And it happens to be those that have burnt. And here you can see part of Blue Mountains. And here you can also see the green bit, which didn't burn, and that happens to burn a few years earlier. So abandonment is not preservation, in my view. We can't just abandon national parks, leave them to sort of be wild and think nature will look after itself. I think the humans are essential part of the ecosystem, as the Aboriginal people would know. They used to burn the bush quite regularly, and to gain access through it, to maintain patterns and encourage new growth, to attract food or food game, to encourage development of useful food plants for themselves, and of course signaling spiritual reasons and so on. But they were absolutely vital, indispensable part of the ecosystem for thousands of years, and we are, of course, aware of it, and lots is being done in that direction, but perhaps that's not quite enough to just burn things regularly. I think conscious, intentional, integrated landscape management is something we have to look into a bit more. This is, of course, not Australia, but some of the landscape around Australia doesn't look too dissimilar, and Australia inevitably was referred to as gentleman's park looking, or look-alike, by the first arrivals, when the Aboriginal people still looked after it. And in our contemporary sort of looking at things, we might say that it would be appropriate to have areas evenly distributed, treated as village or residences, then surrounded by productive land, and then the wilderness could sort of coexist within certain proximity where it's still manageable, and it's not too vast and abandoned and left to its own devices and the devices of the fire. Better modes of occupation of land. So there I would say that, of course, neither isolation or overcrowding is sustainable. Like a lot of people run away from the city and move out on a little farm, and then it burns down, and then then we are where we are currently, with all the devastation of these usually isolated dwellings somewhere on the edge of the bush. So isolation generally is not sustainable. Like, we don't operate well as individuals, and overcrowding, of course, it's quite clear that is not particularly sustainable. So I think small environmentally conscious settlement units would be appropriate, as we have seen through most of the world throughout the best parts of its history. I think the eco-villages used to be a bit of a hippie thing, in the 60s, but these days it's completely realistic to open our vast landscape to small sustainable settlements, because we can produce locally off-grid electricity easily. We can waste manage easily. We can, we don't need sewer system anymore with all these advanced composting systems we have available. Transport is easy, and especially remote working. I think this virus crisis has opened up a whole lot of opportunities, and I think we now realize that it is possible to exist in a fairly local way and have a global impact. So I think new legislation is needed for this. We had the SEP 15 in New South Wales and some other law in some other places, but that's been repealed, the SEP 15, and now it's reasonably difficult to actually settle a block of land with a sustainable small settlement. So I think that should be probably something to look at. And then the sense of ownership, belonging, and continuity, of course, when you create these small little villages, perhaps we will shift towards a more non-transient occupation and occupation of landscape, and we will not tend to just treat it as a disposable, a source of income. That's a big one. So this is like an example of what a appropriate sized settlement might look like in Australia. This one's in Romania, but you get the sense that there's a certain community, not too big, not too small. Then you have the sort of ring of the productive land, which could provide certain degree of self-sufficiency. And then you have the wilderness around, which can be managed. Perhaps it is 2 kilometers across. So with my limited knowledge of biology, it can support a complete ecosystem. Yet if it's on fire, it's reasonably easy to put out, and definitely you can stop the spread. So if we had a village like this every 10-15 kilometers, I think it wouldn't be so easy to burn the land down. And very lastly, better design and construction of individual buildings. Like, I think every one of you will have opinions on that, and probably good ones. So I'm not going to go into much detail, but I think holistic design in architecture would be something that is required. We should include landscaping, not just buildings, and landscaping for resilience, sustainability, and sustenance, such as water retention, fire retardant, and productive plants. For example, I don't see why would I specify planting that doesn't produce food, so why plant anything other than fruit trees in a garden, or why, plant some beautiful shrubs that you can't put in your pasta? So I think it's a waste of water and space, really. So little things like that. And then, we have the endemic design, my favorite, based on locally sourced materials, which essentially through their physical properties, inform the color schemes that the buildings result in, and the forms. So stone behaves differently to timber and so on. You end up with buildings that speak of their own time and individuality, but also they kind of speak a similar design language that's defined by the materials that you're using and the climatic conditions. So you create something that's quite beautiful. I call it the beautiful resilience. And my big favorite is hempcrete, which sequesters carbon, can be locally produced. It is amazing for farmers because it grows basically anywhere with any kind of amount of water, doesn't need much of it, fixes soil, is recyclable, is pest and fire resistant, carbon neutral or negative, controls moisture, it's retrofittable, it's just perfect, so use it. And yeah, and then just last couple of thoughts to leave you with would be that the architecture, in my view, performs poorly as an instrument of political ideology, social engineering, or wealth creation. I think good architecture is about finding practical solutions inspired in nature. It typically comes with the byproduct of beauty. And just some books that you probably know, and a couple of online resources, the hempmasonry.com.au and the GeoSip, which is like a new block product made of hemp, which is quite amazing. Finally, something that we can perhaps use and sell to clients very easily. It's quite a predictable thing, and it just grows from the ground, and it sucks in carbon. What else do you? What better thing to ask of a building material? So yeah, thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Andrew.
Sweet, thank you very much, Yuri. That was really great and informative, and we'll get to some questions at the end. Andrew, if you jump straight in.
No worries. Is that all good? Can you hear me? See the screen?
Yep.
Yep, working well.
That's good.
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation to you both, and definitely thanks for the invitation to, the invitation, but thanks to Yuri for starting Architects Assist, which I think is quite an amazing thing. The fact that we need it is quite depressing, but I think important that we do have it nonetheless. My practice is called SUPERCONTEXT, so we've been in practice for about 6 years, based in Sydney, but we sort of have done some regional work in New South Wales and in the ACT. We are generally not a residential practice, so we have mostly focused on commercial and educational projects, particularly adaptive reuse projects. But so when this, I guess, came along, we signed up almost immediately, not necessarily because we thought it was our expertise, but because we thought it was absolutely something that needed to be done, and that every architect that didn't sign up shouldn't be called an architect. We're sort of a reasonably small office. We're between 4 to 6 people, and a lot of the work that's shown in this presentation has been done by both Colette in our office and Edouard in our office, I guess, who really took this initiative on board. And I'll go a little bit through about our fees maybe later on, just sort of generally our structure. Someone's got a microphone there in the background that's on. Sorry. Sorry. So, I mean, our practice has been looking for opportunities to do either pro bono or at least sort of, I guess, reduced fee work for some time for either public bodies, charities, not-for-profits, and we just, I guess, haven't had an opportunity. So when this opportunity came, I guess we leapt at it. This was the email that we sort of received from Yuri, and it's really interesting seeing the timeline of, I guess, how early we were in the process, and being one of the first referrals, I guess, is quite fascinating to know. One of the first clients that came to you. The email was sort of, the bottom part is really the request from the client to Yuri, and then above that, the sort of a correspondence where basically Yuri says, "Hello, I've received this recommendation. I've sent it to 2 professionals in the directory. One of whom is Philip Arnold, who I think is an amazing architect. Whoever responds first will get the job." So I literally had this in my phone and picked it up at a coffee and just said yes, respond kind of thing. and then got a call from Philip Arnold saying, "Oh, bugger, you got me by like 20 seconds." So it was quite entertaining. But in the end, sort of, Philip's actually had a look at this design a few times. So we took it as an opportunity to collaborate with Philip, who's a great architect from our perspective. But I mean, this was sort of the brief that we were given when we started this commission. It was pretty straightforward. Basically, they had an expected payout from an insurer of just under $500,000. Given that it was burnt down, we expected it was going to be a flame zone build, and we'd done one flame zone house before, and we knew that that could be problematic and extremely expensive. Nonetheless, I guess we met the clients, and they are and were absolutely fantastic people, very, very engaged with what architects do. The sort of husband of the couple was actually a builder and a project manager who'd moved into earth moving. And so the first thing they did was he got all his friends up to the site with machines and leveled the site. So some of the problems that sort of Yuri was mentioning didn't necessarily apply to us to a certain degree. But also, as he had a background in construction, he was also quite direct as to what materials we were going to use, because he could source a series of things through connections. So, for example, hempcrete I don't think was really on the cards. But nonetheless, really great clients. Just in case anyone doesn't know where the Kangaroo Valley is, this is Sydney, Sydney Basin. The Kangaroo Valley is about 2 to 2.5 hours south. So this is Wollongong and Port Kembla, which used to be, still is, a major industrial hub south of Sydney. That's about an hour and a half. And the Kangaroo Valley sort of sits in this area here as a connection from the sort of lower, really, really beautiful country that leads down to the ocean and up into the Southern Highlands, and then back up into Sydney through southwestern Sydney. It is an absolutely stunning, stunning location, surrounded by a national park to the north. This is the Moreton National Park to the south, which is ultimately what the fire was related to that destroyed this house. So to the site, I guess to be honest, we felt like this was an amazing opportunity. We'd given our services, and we were very willing to do a large portion of them pro bono, because we believed, I guess, in what Architects Assist stands for. But sort of the fact that we then ended up with a house in the Kangaroo Valley was quite an amazing, I guess, chance. This is the house here, just on the left-hand side, and basically this is the Moreton National Park. So it connects all the way down here through Nowra, quite a massive extent of, of national park. So again, if we're kind of in here, this runs all the way down here. It's a really, really significant conservation area. The strangest thing we saw when we went to site was that this house burnt, this house survived, this house burnt, this house survived. It was sort of completely arbitrary, or seemed to us very unpredictable exactly what the fire did and how it ended up. But make no mistake, this was the result of the fire. This is looking north, away from sort of where the actual house was destroyed, through to the Southern Highlands and the escarpment where the Southern Highlands drops down towards Wollongong through the Kangaroo Valley. And this was what was left on the house of our sort of first site visit. These photos are taken by Hamish McIntosh, who's a great photographer who we work with quite a lot. But you can sort of see the earth moving already happening. The first thing that our client did, I think, is definitely a method of dealing with the stress and the sort of anxiety and this, I guess, the overwhelming sense of loss that had come from their house. And I believe this was their primary residence, was to move earth moving equipment up there straight away and start getting to work. So he'd already started clearing dead trees, already started clearing away the wreckage of the shed. I believe he was there at least half the week while he was working on site in Shoalhaven at the same time. So I guess we came to a clients who were very, very motivated to keep moving. And I think they had taken this as a kind of opportunity to, I guess, build their forever home. So they bought this block of land with an existing house on it. As best I understand, the house was built before the majority of the bushfire regulations that we now have in Australia and New South Wales came on board. So it was definitely not fit for purpose in terms of where it was situated. From what I understand, it was basically a kit home. this is sort of the client's photos actually during the bushfire. So they were there during a portion of it, initially looking potentially to defend. And then I believe they made the decision that they couldn't defend, so they left, which I think was a good idea. But you sort of got an idea of the general house that was there. Fairly straightforward, simple house, very centralized rooms, and a veranda all the way around the outside, and then a series of sheds and sort of infrastructure systems around it. It was off the grid when we came to it, and the intent was that the future house would also be off the grid. As connecting services up there other than what was already there would be extremely difficult and extremely expensive, if not impossible. This was sort of some of the photos that were provided to us of what the house was before. So from terms of a bushfire perspective, I think it's quite poor. It's got open foundations underneath the veranda. That veranda is basically a fire source in its own right. Definitely not a house that should ever have been built in an environment like that. But again, we understand it was built sometimes before the codes came into place that enforce this higher level of diligence and protection of the asset and protection of life that's come about since. The clients sort of came to us also with a brief, very, very specific, because they'd lived there for quite a few years as far as I understood it, and they'd really formed, I guess, a great affection to the site. The tree on the right-hand side was known as Ent from Lord of the Rings, if you have watched those films rather. And I think the first discussions we had was really what they almost wanted, what they had originally, which was known as the White House to their neighbours. It was the White House sitting up on the hill as you drove up the road. And that was kind of where they really wanted to return to. I guess we started to a certain degree quite traditionally. I guess I said we've had experience with one bushfire house before, which was in flame zone. Being the worst sort of scenario where the house is going to be subject to the direct exposure of bushfire flames for an extended period of time. And that's extremely dangerous environment as well as very stringent design criteria. But again, we needed to approach it, I guess, traditionally like an architect's engagement. We had a client-architect agreement. That client-architect agreement had all the standard terms and conditions that you would have in every other project. The difference was that we agreed to do our concept design and design development phases pro bono. We would then do development application at hourly rates, basically to negotiate the contract, the application through the local council. And then after that, documentation and any site work we would do at cost rates, not profit rates. And we essentially saw that as a way that we could come to the table without limiting the importance of the diligence that we still needed to do for the job to a point where we couldn't actually do the diligence properly. And as a small practice of 3 or 4 people, we couldn't, I suppose, wear the entire project pro bono. And the clients were absolutely understanding of that. And as best as we saw it, it was sort of $20,000 or whatever it might have been at billings that could go towards the rebuild on what was going to be a pretty tight budget. The site is very, very steep. So across even where the existing building was built and sort of leveled out onto a flat pad, you can sort of see the contours fall away really, really, really quickly. So across our site alone, just where the house was, there was probably from here to there, there's more than 10 meters fall. Very, very steep, surrounded on both sides, on all 3 sides, sorry, other than the northern aspect, by quite dense bushland. And as far as like the worst possible place to build a house, and talking of worst possible places to build a house, 2 ravines on either side that were really heavily forested, and the fire just ripped up both the ravines up the hill behind and took out the entire hill. And the house is kind of smack bang in the middle of it. The site was also really, really irregular. So we were basically smack on one boundary and the other side was defined by a ravine. So in terms of where we could actually build safely, incredibly limited, if not the right spot at all. But like all clients, they, I guess, had a very particular view of where they wanted the house to build. And this was kind of the high enough point where you weren't right in the middle of the foliage that you could actually get the view back out to the escarpment leading up to the Southern Highlands. So it probably was, from one perspective, a really perfect spot to put a house, and that you could look out on the view. It faced due kind of north-northeast. A lot of good things happening for it, but in terms of what you could actually do in terms of protection of the vegetation around you, incredibly, incredibly limited. And basically our initial bushfire advice from a bushfire consultant was don't go any further east, west, or south, and do everything you can to try and go further to the north, which is also down the hill. So every time we went further north and down the hill, we lost the view, and the clients, I guess, weren't willing to give that up, and I understand that completely because it's an amazing site. I guess the way we started the discussion was pretty similar to any other commission. We started with references and sort of said, what do you guys like? And I guess we took this definitely as not an opportunity for us to push what we like. It was definitely not a project with an agenda where we wanted to get this custom amazing house built in the Kangaroo Valley that we could make our career off. Nothing like that at all. We took this as an opportunity to say, well, what do you like? What do you want from this house, and what do you want to produce? Here are some ideas that we've got. Some of these, obviously, the top two are Glen Murcutt references, Farnsworth House, of course, we all know, and an Owen Architecture reference from Queensland. To achieve these under bushfire-related conditions is extremely difficult. And again, to their credit, the clients are very understanding of that. And also, having a building background, understood that this would come with a great cost implication. So maybe we could just limit it to the core living rooms of the house to achieve this connection between the forest at the back, the view at the front, the feeling of being outdoors, and that essentially it would all have to have big fire shutters over it, which would cost a lot of money. But I guess that's where we started the project, and I wonder if it's sort of the obligatory start to an Australian landscape house these days. You almost have to start with something long and thin. You have to face every room to the view and every room to the north, and a massive sort of living wrapped around it where all the rooms open out to it. And again, as I said earlier, we're not residential specialists. We've never designed a freestanding house ever. We've never had one built. About 90% of our projects are adaptive use. So it's a fairly new territory for us, but we have had some experience with bushfire building. And I guess it got really interesting to try and manage the client's desire for this kind of house. This, I believe, was going to be their forever home, with the aspect of bushfire. If it's a house this wide, it's probably going to be in the flame zone because it's too close to the west and east. So how do we manage that over time? So maybe we look about doing these long, thin houses actually as a series of interventions into the landscape that happen over time as the budget allows, and as you actually decide whether you need to expand the house to that extent or not. So the first sort of question was, can we just build the core on the sort of right-hand side, pretty 820 square metre house, one bedroom, one bathroom, combined living area, and that could be the sort of core that you start with to get back to living on this site. And then you could extend the pavilion and the garage as you needed it, which had a study in it, as these one of them worked from home or wanted to work from home remotely. And then maybe you could build the guest wing and tack it on, and maybe you could build the mudroom, the laundry, and tack it on. So there was sort of a way of moving through it that didn't require them to use all of the funds up front. They could just get back there living on the site as soon as possible with a reasonably small build. But the main, I guess, challenges there was that no matter what we did with this house, everything was going to be flame zone. And my understanding of the bushfire codes was that once any part of the house is classified as flame zone, the whole thing is flame zone. It's not like, I believe there was in the previous house we designed under bushfire codes, there was some ability to limit certain facades exposure to that level of requirement. The contemporary codes don't allow that. If any of it's flame zone, it's all flame zone, even if the front facade is not exposed directly to the trees. This was sort of the first presentation we had with them, the first discussions about this sort of long, thin house with a cool sweeping roof, big, wide veranda. And I think as we kept moving through the process, we were doing a lot of iterations, a lot of testing, starting with sort of the classic Glen Murcutt on the bottom, and then expanding, breaking it out, trying to increase what we thought a very tight core of a house that would need to have the fire rating, to additional areas on the outside which may be sacrificial, might not require the fire ratings, which we're still working through. Just as sort of a caveat on where we got to with this project, we really only got through the beginning of concept design. So we went through sort of an options analysis, began the process. We were only really coming to an agreement on a preferred option when the project was put on hold. And I guess we're not expecting necessarily to come back, because I think, like everyone now, it was put on hold for COVID reasons. And probably the insurance payout is not enough to justify a house like this on its own right. the sort of experiments continued where we just tried to pull things out, push things out, but then at the same time, there was this, I think, sense that we needed to draw it back in upon itself, that the exposure to the bush was too much. We were also getting advice from the bushfire consultant that it's just, you're too exposed. This will be a flame zone house. You need to try and minimize that, not just for the design criteria, but also for a risk to the asset. And this house, which started kind of like this, I guess, slowly began to sort of pull back on itself. And Edouard did like 50 options in the file and just kept changing, kept testing. But I think we eventually just started to wrap this house back on itself. And bit by bit, the sort of rooms started to curl around the sides just to sort of protect it in a core, put the living rooms to the north and the face, put the bedrooms and the bathrooms on the east and the west, and just bring this house back in upon itself a little bit more protectively. But still the veranda sort of maintained its presence, I guess. And this is sort of the other option. So our first design presentation had this option and the long thin house to talk to the clients through about what we thought the strengths and the pros and the cons of each of the different options were. I mean, I think this almost speaks to we had two sets of references when we started this project. One was sort of the set of references of your classic long house. The other set of references was a classic tight house, I guess, which might have reference to Australian colonial homesteads. Shinohara, a Japanese architect that we're sort of looking at more and more as he becomes more and more popular amongst hipsters. I think this was almost a concurrent narrative. So we had one set of options looking at the long house, and it sort of eventually found its way back and back and back down into these much tighter kind of organizations. And this is sort of the scheme that we presented at that first meeting: 4 pods under a single roof with an interconnected internal space. The veranda still did its wrapping thing, but this exposed a significantly less amount of facade space to the bushfire risk and could protect a sort of internal area which each of the rooms could borrow off. So sort of after the project got put on hold, we've sort of been continuing to develop it a little bit on our own right. So these drawings are kind of the next development stage, which I guess is our own design development for our own purposes. And I think we continued with that logic that the house would sit with a veranda largely wrapping it, a few kind of main pods. In this case, it's 4 main pods. Again, the clients were really, it was important that they could lie in bed and look at the view. So we sort of shifted that pod out. We wanted sort of a public gesture, if you want to call it that people coming up the veranda could slip into the house through a sort of passageway that then opened up to an interior life, which was quite distinct from this always outwardly focusing thing about Australian architecture in the landscape that we always do, these long, thin buildings. When you talk about sort of amount of area captured to facade space, they're not the most efficient, but they do a lot of other great things like thin floor plates in terms of cross ventilation, access to sun, a lot of great things they do. But when you're talking about a bushfire scenario, I think we maybe had an intuitive sense that it needed to fold back in upon itself. And the intent there was that we'd only have to fire rate that exterior of the project. If it was flame zone, if it was BAL 40, we thought that this house would be a BAL 40 house. So the requirements of the protection against bushfire and also the risk to the house and the risk to our clients would just come down by pushing it forward, more compact away from the bush to the south. But by fire rating that, we could essentially open up this internal space, which with this facade, we would only put in the minimum number of penetrations that we required for BCA compliance in terms of access to natural light, access to natural ventilation. And we weren't quite up to that level of detail yet, and we're still not as to what is the absolute minimum penetration we can put in that facade to protect it. And also given the sort of very tight cost of this project to not have bushfire shutters everywhere or not have fire-rated glazing everywhere. And that would open up this kind of internal life where each of the rooms, and sort of this bedroom has a window in this corner, so that just connects into this little courtyard. This bedroom can look out into that courtyard. This bedroom can look out into that courtyard. This living room can sort of expand itself by opening into that courtyard. And then the bushfire shutters are here, 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 and here. And when the house is sort of in use, those shutters can be opened up. The house can ventilate through the centre. We weren't sure if we'd be allowed to get open roof there because that might expose again the southern to the flame zone. So we're still working through those issues, but at least some skylights to make this sort of internal figure as important as the more traditional long linear figure of these houses. And that we thought created a really interesting opportunity to, we saw it almost as a communal breakout space in the centre, so that if there were guests staying, if the residents themselves were there, that space could become a space of interaction rather than very long, thin, single-loaded corridors along the southern side of a house facing north. That's that sort of figure that I guess we saw connected right through to the terrace out the front, which does face the view, and the sort of outdoor bricks fire, wood-fired pizza kind of oven that again the client really wanted to have on that side, and potentially a little southern terrace that connected out to another kind of little southern area, all under one big roof. And the roof was designed to be as efficient as we possibly could. We were considering that it would be made out of prefabricated roofing panels, structurally insulated panel system, sit on a very simple steel frame if a frame was required at all, if the walls of the building itself couldn't produce the load requirements. And then one kind of classic, I guess a Japanese move there of a king post that essentially holds up the entire roof from one point in the living room. It was a really steep site, as I said, so this kind of site, and the client being an earth mover, by the time we'd sort of started designing even the first ideas, he sort of gave me a call and said, "I'll just let you know I've leveled the site. There's nothing left. It's a completely flat pad, and I've also pushed it out 3 meters towards the north so we can go further that way." Which was kind of fantastic in a way, because a lot of the roadblocks that other projects might have faced, this project didn't necessarily face. And they were sort of happening concurrently, and we'd get fed little bits of information and go, okay, well, let's feed that into the process now. This is sort of a section through the living area and that courtyard in the centre, and this sort of southern terrace. Terraced vegetable gardens, a shed being off grid. The intent was that that roof of that shed and the roof of the front here would provide, they would provide something like a 10 kilowatt system, a significant amount of power, more than enough to run the house entirely, as well as a battery system that the client was intending to put in. This is sort of the cross section, I guess, the other way, not up the hill or with the grain of the hill, but across the long way, showing those 2 ravines on either side. And that's kind of one of the major fire sources that this thing had to retract from to keep itself really compact away from all the bushfire sources around it if they couldn't be cleared, which they could to a certain degree. And this is sort of where we got to, and by where we got to, I mean literally this morning I'm finishing these images of a sort of house that is the White House. It's a very different variation of the White House I think that they're expecting to have, where the terrace at the front, I guess, does become the major outdoor life of the house, but the house itself sort of opened up and allowed people to sort of slip inside into what was, we thought, the really rich part of the house. And the more we looked at this house, we thought it could be richer and richer in the way that people lived. And I guess the way we pose it to the clients is, I think everyone knows how to live in these long, thin houses now. This house you would take a little bit of time to learn how to live in, but it had potentially more sophistication in the way that it could do that because of that internal space. It wasn't as literal perhaps as it first appeared. Again, these are sort of some of the visualizations we were working on, like where might we use fire-rated glazing that didn't need a bushfire shutter as either a little feature or somewhere that someone could look out, even in the case of being under attack, to sort of see what's happening around. But then the house does kind of open up and you kind of slip inside to this, I guess, indoor life, which we did see as that kind of really refined, restrained courtyard that tried to draw as much light if we were allowed to, if we got the kind of regs to work from above. This is sort of the bedroom on the left-hand side with oblique views into the as we've stolen here from some Japanese garden. And this was sort of the living room again, connecting in there, but also connecting through. The king post sort of sitting oddly in the middle of the room, which we quite enjoyed, and the other views out from the kind of bedrooms into that courtyard, which we thought it could be a really, really fantastic space, not only just as a useful space, maybe you didn't need to be always out on the balcony, maybe you could be more inside, maybe it was inclement weather and you didn't feel like you had to be out on the veranda getting bashed by wind. You could sit inside and still have a kind of exterior experience, rather than, I guess, feeling that the opportunity of nature was always a danger to you by being external to you and a threat, that at the same time you could sort of bring a bit of that inside and maybe have some of that experience internally. Thank you. Again, thanks for Yuri for being awesome and starting Architects Assist. Thanks for EmAGN, to Phil and Sam for inviting me for the talk. I guess I'll open it to any questions, guys.
Yeah, cool. All right, guys. Well, we might, I mean, we're kind of over time, but we might extend it for another 10 minutes. Is that okay with you, and Andrew? If there's any questions from
Problems.
the audience. So we might wait a couple minutes before those questions come through, but I guess we might start like, what inspired you to, start Architects Assist in the first place, I think, is quickly.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a coincidence, of course, like anything else, but I guess driving through darkness at 12 p.m., running away from the fire front basically for 2 or 3 weeks, choking with smoke, and then trying to offer services as an individual, like what Andrew said and many other architects and designers. I think most of us would have at some point offered help to, somebody in our life, and particularly at a time like this one. The problem here was that maybe, like I said, maybe the overcrowding of the victims, kind of, which in a highly emotional situation like that might come across as negative, So I think the organized effort I think I saw as needed, and that very much worked. So yeah, but coincidence really, no higher inspiration.
And was it based off any sort of previous models that you've seen? I know you've done a bunch of pro bono work before and a bit of work.
Well, I guess I got a bit of a computing background, so just the ease for me to put a system like this together, like programmatically, not having to pay someone, so it's like a natural thing, like in the past, maybe I tried to start like, I don't know, item exchange, like things that people have in their garages and they just sit there. So, that's been done before as well. But, I've sort of tried a thing like that here and there. And then, like the occasional community work that we've done with the other students still at uni. And after that, so the ArchiCamp, I mean, communities respond very well to kind of non-pushy kind of, self-introduction, like, hello, I'm here if you need me. And I think that there's like a really fine balance between offer of help and demand of it being taken up. So I think it's definitely about being available and being clearly there, but not not offering yourself, but sort of making it known that you're there to help. And
I think for you, Andrew, I've just got a quick question with your client sort of social attitudes towards architects, because I feel like with regional, potential regional clients, they would never have thought of like having an architect involved in building their house. So I don't know if you see a difference with, your other clients compared to your more regional clients, obviously with an earth mover. And I guess to you, Yuri, as well, after this is like, have you seen any sort of differences with more regional clients?
Look, our clients were great. I guess given his background, he had very strong opinions about construction, and he maybe, to be completely fair, he knew more about construction than I did. So I guess I took that as an opportunity to really, I didn't want to be someone that told them I knew better. I think it's important when you get clients that do have a background in it to sort of bring them along with the journey, that you're at least on the same page about why you might be doing things. So were they, I guess, regional clients? Possible. I don't know if that's really the right term, because both had worked in big cities. One was Melbourne based at the time, working remotely. The one was an earth mover, but had been a project manager for a major sort of Sydney based construction company. So That said, I mean, they were very trusting of an architect's advice, and I guess that was something quite refreshing because some of my other commercial clients aren't always that, I guess, trusting of an architect's advice. It's much more challenged. So I think in this case, they were really, really clear that this was their experience, this is what they knew, this is what they thought, but they were really open to alternate opinions and they were trusted our expertise. And I think that's important when you come to a thing like Architects Assist. You'd hope that there is, at least to start with, you're coming to it with a basis of these people know something that I don't, or they have a skill that I need to redeliver what I need to deliver or what I need to be in my life. So there's a certain level of trust there. Have I found that with other regional clients? Again, not necessarily, because a lot of what I'd say regional clients, they're probably city people moving to the country. So they have, I guess, a different impression towards professionalism, which when we deal with commercial clients can be challenged in a lot of ways that sometimes the residential architecture is not as challenged. And as I said, I'm not a particularly residential focused architect, so I'm very used to being challenged and sort of ignored rather than trusted. So for me, it was actually quite a pleasant change.
Yeah. With your clients, you mentioned that he sort of had an idea of the construction method, what he was going to do. They obviously were thinking about it as maybe their forever home, their dream home, and they were quite certain about the siting. Did you have any awkward conversations, keeping in mind what the bushfire consultant would have advised about whether they should be doing it at all?
No, we never had discussions about whether they should be rebuilding on the site. I think the discussions were simply where do we get this to a position where you're comfortable and you understand the risks that you're taking and you understand the cost implications of what you're doing. I don't think there was ever a question that they wouldn't rebuild similar to where they were if this was really going to be where they were going to live for the rest of their lives. And I really believe they saw that being where they were. So we never really had discussions of should we be rebuilding on this site at all. We had discussions more about how do we get us both into a position where I feel like you're fully aware of the risks that you're taking. We've gone through all the outcomes that could lead to in terms of both a cost implication for what you've got to build, but also are you exposing yourself to unnecessary risk by building there? And to the end, again, the sort of client who had the building background was basically saying, look, I've accepted that we're going to go pretty hard on here. We're just going to get the house that we want and we're going to do whatever fire systems we need because I've got connections that can deliver that fire system. And again, I did feel really uncomfortable about that because part of the big discussion for me with this project is, do you really have the budget to do this? And things kept coming up with infrastructure. Like, it's like, okay, it wasn't so much the house design itself, it was all the stuff around the outside of the house. It's the septic tank that has to be redone because the existing septic system had failed and wasn't compliant anymore. It was the outbuildings have to be fire protected. Is it a sprinkler system? There then has to be an underground tank to connect water from the roof, which is pumped up to the main tank at the back to supply the sprinkler system because there's no water connection for the site. Then there has to be 10 kilowatts of power. Then there has to be a battery. So it was actually, I think, all of that systems that I certainly probably underestimated the impact they would have, as well as the client have a very particular view on what they wanted from the house from a desire perspective, and also having been through a very traumatic experience. An opportunity to rebuild, get it right, and feel like they could be made whole again, I guess, is certainly part of the emotional part of it.
Got a pretty long question from Kimberly here. I'll just read that. Kimberly has said that she's been at least 10 disaster relief webinars in the last 6 months, and not once has architects been mentioned as part of the recovery process. Building back better has been mentioned in passing once or twice, but essentially the architecture industry isn't even at the table with the major decision makers following a disaster. How can we get a seat with the appropriate people? For example, politicians at all levels and organisations like Red Cross, local fire services and local councils. Might put that to you, Yuri, if you've got any.
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, that's one thing that I keep running into and having lots of opinions on. It's the issue that we are being seen and oftentimes present ourselves as some form of luxury goods. You know, I'm not a registered architect, so I'm not like an architect, right? But like the education, I'm probably going to be very soon. So it's just a formality, I suppose. But nevertheless, I try not to present myself as, luxury goods. Like, I essentially present myself not even as a building designer. I call myself a draftsman, at least in my marketing. And so people approach me and they oftentimes expect just that, you know, a house drafted to their particular needs.
We've lost Yuri for a bit, but he'll be back. He's streaming in from...
It's Launceston, isn't he?
Yeah. That's
this kind of bush pocket. Sorry, is it working? Yeah. So people approach me expecting not, to pay me 10% of the building cost, but they approach me as a, draftee, and then they're surprised with, my credentials and portfolio, and they go, oh, wow. And then, and they're not paying me 10% of, they're paying me basically for what they would pay a draftsperson. And I think that's very close to what an architect would charge from sort of the initial concept to the DA drawings, right? And if the building is simple enough, you can build from it. You don't need to pay me for, complete project documentation. You don't need to pay me for contract administration. I don't essentially need to do those services for everyone. And I find that I'm actually going through a fairly large number of clients on probably a monthly basis even. And they find it quite affordable, and I don't feel like I'm underselling myself at all. It's just, I think the terminology brings me clients that would never think of engaging an architect. And what is a building designer? It's kind of, that could be anything. So I think how we market ourselves, how we present ourselves. So I think it's very much the image of being luxury goods, and we should much more be seen as absolutely essential, and particularly in this context of environmental degradation and all kinds of environmental risks. Like that's what we're good at. But as long as as long as the outside impression, the world's impression is that they'll pay us, 50 grand for a basic house, we're not going to get these people to come through our doors. And the government and the ignorance of the architects as part of the solution is just natural extension of that attitude, I guess.
Yeah, you mentioned as well, I guess, in some of the discussions we had leading up to this, that you've had a bit of difficulty getting traction with sort of any regional media in terms of Architects Assist specifically.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how have those discussions sort of gone, and why do you think that there's a reluctancy to get involved with it?
Well, possibly it's connected to what I just said as well. Like maybe the regional journalists don't see what architect can do for someone who just needs a home. I really don't think they see architects and graduates, whatever. I don't think they see us as someone who's there to help. It's really very much a thing of luxury to have an architect design your house. Every real estate listing will say architecturally designed, as if something special has occurred about the building. Nothing really has occurred special about that building. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably extension of it again. The regional media, they think, yeah, these architects will come here in their shiny cars from Sydney and tell us how to live and blah blah. I think that's what it comes down to. So there's been this kind of bit of a disconnect I found between the local media, kind of lack of interest, not really pushing the availability of the service. Yeah, I think it really is the way we present ourselves. I mean, a lot of us complain that people misunderstand the profession and stuff, but I think we could maybe, and it also is kind of entrenched deeply in the professional culture. Like even the tests that I'm going through now, the ARB, the registration sort of process, like it's all about these complex legal problems that you can run into, and like it's a massive thing, like architecture doesn't have to be that difficult. It really is about better carpentry, like it's putting posts and beams together, really, like in most cases. And I mean, what Andrew has shown was a beautiful example of that. That was a basic Australian dwelling done really beautifully, but it can, but doesn't necessarily need to cost 50 grand. Like it should be deliverable at 7, and then pass it on to the builder, pass it on to client, and then they can deal with it. and that's how I see, like, I get, my clients are essentially in the sort of bottom of the market, I guess, for budget wise, you know, residential clients. So maybe the projects are 300-400 grand, you know, somewhere there, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. And these people have no issues with my designs, and they're by no means conventional, you know, but it's just the way I present myself. And I'm kind of glad that I have to say that I'm not an architect, that I have to say I'm a draftsman, because that actually opened my eyes to this, you know, like that's actually where the power of the profession is, that it's accessible, not cheap. I'm not cheap, but I just don't have to do everything that an architect thinks and is led to believe that they must do, you know. I think we could easily just hand over to the builders, but let's not send these clients straight to building designers. If they don't have the money for a full service, let's still give them at least a sketch, you know? So, and that will then lead to the change of attitudes towards the profession, I guess.
What are your thoughts on this, Andrew, in terms of architects advocating at a higher level, potentially, and where we can be part of that decision-making for disaster relief, I guess?
Oh, man, look, there's two aspects to that one. I completely agree with what Jerry's saying. I mean, I think part of the issue is that we are seen as a luxury good, and that does make it very difficult to contribute, but that also comes down to the way that our profession, I guess, protects itself. How do we get in front of the right people? That's a very difficult question, and I think there is a much broader role of the architect as an advocate. And I don't know if anyone here came to watch the presentation that Guillaume and Fernandez Abascal organised from Belgium, I think it was last week, a few weeks ago, about the policy whisperer, that architects could maybe take on a role as being in public life in some form and actually advocating to the right people the value of design in general. And I don't think that needs to come as an architect or a draftsperson or whatever. It'll be interesting to see what this, I mean, there's certainly legislation changing now in New South Wales with the Design and Practitioners Act, the registration of registered designers in New South Wales, which extends beyond architects to all kind of different people, and what that might mean in terms of actually regulation around who is suitable to design buildings. That's possibly a step in the right direction. How that relates exactly to bushfire, I'm not sure. I totally agree that you can do a great set of sort of concept design drawings and give that to a builder, and if there is a competent builder in place, they should be able to deliver that building. Maybe part of the problem is there aren't as many competent builders around as there used to be. Maybe there's not as many competent architects around as there used to be. I think there is a much bigger issue around training and the knowledge that architects actually have, because I think maybe to the point architects have become slightly more conceptual and slightly less practical and slightly less pragmatic than they need to be to actually address real problems without falling into luxury goods to the people that can afford poets to design their houses. So yeah, I mean, that's, I guess, my point, but I think being in the right rooms with the right people is something really hard to do, and there are some people around that are doing that and trying to be there for those discussions. I think it's something that we all need to work on as a profession, actually.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's definitely like another talk that we should run as well. That could go on for hours. Cool. Well, I guess we might start wrapping up, but Yuri, someone's asked, are you guys still accepting student volunteers, applications, or how can people get in with Architects Assist, I guess?
So, you know, unfortunately for months now, I've been, you know, telling everyone, be patient, and in the virus, it's, you know, double that. So, so it's about patience. Like, of course, the form to register interest as students in potentially volunteering in all these potentially even some bigger projects is still online. And if you haven't signed up yet, you can. There is 1,500 students, and, you know, I mean, I'd be keen to go somewhere and start digging or putting something together for somebody, but these things happen really, really slowly. For the time being, we have like a Facebook group where architects who are keen to get a student on board can post their upcoming projects and involve students, select them on their own criteria, and, you know, get someone in and have a sort of internship. But that's on Facebook. I don't particularly accept or not accept anyone or anything. Like, it's very decentralized, so I get no say in who's doing what, really. And perhaps we do have, like, you know, 2 or 3 communities who sort of indicated interest to rebuild on a larger scale. So if we do end up in getting involved in one of these, bigger places, it's not communes, not kind of like rural land sharing, whatever, then that would be like a public post for all the students, and then we could go there. I'm imagining in some fantasy world, hopefully we'll go there with 100 students and just spend the weekend making mud bricks or something. That can happen, but it really just, I have no influence over that. Like, I made it known to these to the representatives of the communities, and they know about the massive work power or manpower that we have. The 1,500 people is massive, so they know the potential, but if they use it, that's up to them. I have no say in that, unfortunately. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So I think we've run a fair bit over time now. 30, we were going to do an hour, but so we'll probably wrap it up there. Just the last little thing. If there's anyone out there that has any knows of any Architect Assist projects that are currently ongoing, or any client architect agreements, we'd love to hear about them, because we want to sort of start to expose some more of these stories in a similar manner. I want to say thank you again to Andrew Daly from SUPERCONTEXT, and founder of Architect Assist. And thank you all for joining us this evening. It was a really nice discussion, and really some of the work that's been put all into it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Cool.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye, Andrew.
Bye.
Ciao. See you soon.